Imagine walking into a courtroom where a man's future hangs by a thread. The air is tense, heavy with whispers, and the sharp crack of the judge's gavel silences every voice. The prosecution has laid out its arguments, the defense seems defeated, and a conviction feels inevitable. Yet, in the middle of that cold, rigid environment, something unexpected happens, something so unbelievable that even as it unfolds, people laugh in disbelief before realizing they are witnessing a miracle. This story takes place in Atlanta, Georgia, in a federal courthouse where justice is supposed to prevail. The defendant was a man named James Carter, a hard-working African-American father in his early 40s. He wasn't a wealthy businessman or a politician. He was an ordinary man who had spent his life providing for his family by working 2 jobs, one as a mechanic and the other as a delivery driver. James was known in his neighborhood for his kindness and loyalty, but on this particular day, he sat shackled at the defense table, accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit. The prosecutor painted James as a dangerous man, guilty of fraud and theft. The evidence, though circumstantial, seemed to weigh heavily against him. Witnesses had been pressured to testify. Documents were twisted to look incriminating, and the jury appeared convinced that a guilty verdict was only minutes away. His public defender did his best, but everyone in that courtroom knew the outcome was almost certain. James Carter was going to prison. But James wasn't alone that day. Sitting on the wooden benches, clutching a worn-out stuffed bear, was his 8-year-old daughter, Maya Carter. Maya had begged her grandmother to bring her to court so she could see her father. She was far too young to understand the complexities of law, but she understood one thing clearly. Her daddy was in trouble, and she couldn't let him face it alone. As the judge, Henry Whitman, a stern man in his 60s, rolled into the courtroom in his wheelchair, the atmosphere grew even more rigid. Judge Whitman was respected, but also feared for his cold demeanor and strict adherence to procedure. Years earlier, a devastating car accident had left him paralyzed from the waist down, and though he carried himself with authority, his wheelchair was a constant reminder of his fragility. To him, the law was unshakable. Mercy had no place in his court. The trial proceeded as expected: arguments, objections, evidence presented. But as the final statements drew to a close, Maya could no longer hold back. Her small frame slipped out of her grandmother's arms, and before anyone could stop her, she rushed forward, running past the rows of astonished spectators. The courtroom gasped. Security moved, but Maya stood bravely in the center, her eyes fixed on the judge. Her little voice, trembling but loud, echoed against the marble walls. She didn't cry or plead for sympathy. She made an offer that would stop every heartbeat in that room. She looked at Judge Whitman and said, "If you free my father, I will heal you." The room erupted in laughter. Jurors chuckled, lawyers shook their heads, and the gallery burst into whispers. How could a little girl heal a man who had been paralyzed for years? Some thought she was delusional. Others pitied her innocence, and a few rolled their eyes, annoyed that the trial had been interrupted by what they saw as childish nonsense. But Maya didn't waver. She stood tall, clutching her bear, staring at the judge as if she truly believed every word she spoke. To her, it wasn't a joke. It was a promise. Judge Whitman's face tightened. His gavel came down hard, demanding order. "This is a courtroom, not a circus," he snapped, though something in his eyes betrayed a flicker of vulnerability. The laughter continued, but Maya's words hung in the air like electricity, strange, absurd, yet impossible to dismiss. And then, as the bailiff approached to escort Maya back, something extraordinary began to happen. The bailiff reached for Maya's arm, his large frame towering over her small body, ready to escort her out as the murmurs and laughter in the courtroom continued. But Maya refused to move. Her tiny hands tightened around her bear, and her voice rang out again, clearer this time. with a confidence that silenced even some of the giggles. "I mean it," she said. "If you free my father, I will heal you." The room quieted for just a moment, as though people were waiting for the punchline. Then the laughter came back louder, mixed with disbelief and mocking whispers. One juror leaned over to another, shaking his head as if to say, "Kids and their fantasies." Even the prosecutor smirked, muttering something under his breath about wasted time. But Judge Whitman didn't laugh. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Maya. For years, he had lived with the prison of his wheelchair. Doctors had told him there was no chance of recovery. The nerves were gone, the damage permanent. He had buried the hope of ever walking again. And yet, here was this little girl, staring at him with such certainty, it almost made him uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, his voice hard. "Young lady, this is a courtroom. Miracles don't belong here. The law—" But he stopped mid-sentence. His hand, resting on the wooden armrest of his wheelchair, began to tingle. At first, he thought it was nothing, just nerves, maybe even his imagination. But the sensation grew stronger, like a gentle current of energy moving through him. His fingers twitched. The bailiff froze. He saw it. Gasps rippled through the first few rows as Judge Whitman shifted in his chair, startled by his own movement. For decades, his legs had been lifeless. Now, he could feel something he hadn't felt since the accident. Heat, circulation, life. Maya took a step closer, her dark eyes unblinking, her voice calm yet commanding. "I told you, if you let my daddy go, I will heal you." The laughter died completely. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on the judge now, searching for confirmation that what they thought they saw was real. The prosecutor blinked rapidly. The defense attorney's mouth hung open, and the jury leaned forward, forgetting entirely about the trial they were there to decide. Judge Whitman gripped the arms of his chair tightly. His face was pale, his breathing uneven. This isn't possible," he whispered, mostly to himself. His entire body trembled as though it were awakening from a deep, impossible sleep. And then it happened. His right foot shifted. The sound was so faint a shoe scraping against the floor, but it might as well have been thunder. People gasped. Some even screamed. A woman in the gallery clasped her hands over her mouth. The bailiff stumbled back, his eyes wide, his hand still hovering near Maya, but no longer daring to touch her. Maya didn't move, didn't smile, didn't even blink. She simply raised her hand toward the judge, as if guiding him with invisible strings. "Free my father," she repeated softly, "and I will heal you." The courtroom was chaos now. Reporters scribbled furiously. A juror crossed himself, whispering a prayer. Others sat frozen, unable to believe their own eyes. James Carter, sitting shackled at the defense table, felt tears stream down his face. His heart swelled with pride and terror all at once. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing. His daughter was no ordinary child. Judge Whitman looked down at his legs, his lips trembling. Slowly, painfully, he tried to push against the armrests. His body resisted at first, but then, like a dam breaking, the strength returned. With effort, he lifted himself slightly from the chair. The entire courtroom erupted in pandemonium. "Order!" He shouted, his voice breaking, but no one listened. People were on their feet, pointing, crying, shouting. Some were convinced they were witnessing a trick. Others whispered miracle. The judge sank back into his chair, overwhelmed, sweat beading on his forehead. His eyes darted to Maya, who stood still, watching him with the patience of someone far older than her years. This was no ordinary interruption. This was something no law book could explain, no gavel could silence. And deep down, everyone in that courtroom knew the trial was no longer about James Carter's guilt or innocence. Something far greater was unfolding before their eyes. The silence that followed was heavy, trembling with disbelief. For a moment, no one dared breathe too loudly, as if even the faintest sound might shatter the fragile miracle taking shape in front of them. Judge Henry Whitman, a man who had lived bound to a wheelchair for decades, stared down at his legs in open-mouthed shock. His foot had moved. He had felt it. Not imagined it felt. Maya stood unwavering in the center of the courtroom, her presence commanding, her tiny figure somehow filling the space with more authority than the judge's gavel ever had. Her bear dangled at her side, almost forgotten, as if she had stepped entirely into a role larger than herself. "Free my father," she repeated, her tone calm, almost soothing, "and I will heal you." This time, no one laughed. The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering in frantic, hushed tones. The prosecutor, red-faced and sweating, slammed his papers down in frustration. "This is outrageous. This is a distraction, a trick. Someone planted this child to disrupt these proceedings." His voice cracked as he spoke, betraying the fact that even he was shaken by what he had just witnessed. The defense attorney, on the other hand, sat frozen in awe, his eyes locked on Maya as though he were watching a prophecy unfold. James Carter, her father, could no longer contain himself. He rose halfway from his seat, his shackles clanging, before the bailiff pressed him back down. His voice broke with desperation and pride. "That's my baby. That's my little girl." But all eyes were on Judge Whitman. He tried to steady himself, his hands trembling as he reached for the desk before him. I felt it," he whispered hoarsely. The courtroom gasped again. He hadn't spoken to anyone in particular, but his admission confirmed what every witness feared to believe. It was real. Slowly, he placed both hands on the desk and braced himself. The crowd leaned forward collectively, breaths held tight in their throats. The judge closed his eyes and with visible strain began to rise. First an inch, then another. The legs that had been lifeless for years now trembled under the weight of his body. His face twisted in pain, but his determination was relentless. Sweat trickled down his temples as his knees locked, and for the first time in over 2 decades, Judge Henry Whitman stood upright. The gallery erupted. Some people screamed in shock. Others wept openly. A few shouted hallelujahs as if they were witnessing a revival in the middle of a courthouse. Reporters leapt to their feet, scrambling to capture every detail in their notebooks. Phones and cameras, though restricted, appeared as spectators tried desperately to record history unfolding before their eyes. "Order! Order!" the bailiff shouted, but his own voice cracked with awe. Even he couldn't tear his gaze away from the miracle happening just a few feet away. The prosecutor slammed, his fist on the table again. "This is manipulation. This is theatrics. The court cannot allow this nonsense." But his words died in his throat as Judge Whitman turned toward him, standing tall now, his body trembling but undeniably upright. His voice thundered through the courtroom with a power it hadn't carried in years. "Enough." The words silenced everything. No one had ever heard that tone from the judge before, an echo of authority, but also of freedom, as though he himself had just been unchained. His eyes locked onto Maya, and for the first time in decades, his face softened. He looked at her not as a nuisance, not as a distraction, but as a vessel of something he couldn't explain. "What are you?" he whispered, almost reverently. Maya tilted her head slightly, her braids brushing her cheeks. "I'm just his daughter," she said, pointing at James. "And I believe." The room hung on her words like scripture. The jury, once so sure of its verdict, now sat paralyzed, unsure of what justice even meant in the shadow of what they had just seen. The prosecutor's confidence drained, replaced by fear that he was no longer in control of the room or the case. The judge's knees buckled slightly, and he lowered himself back into his chair, gasping for breath but smiling faintly. I walked, he muttered in disbelief, shaking his head. His hands covered his face as he struggled to process what had just happened. The weight of years of bitterness, hopelessness, and confinement cracked under the force of what he had just experienced. James Carter leaned forward, tears spilling freely down his cheeks. "Please, Your Honor," he begged, his voice raw. "Don't let them take me away. Not after this. You know, I didn't do what they're saying. My little girl believes in me. And now you've seen something greater than lies, greater than the law." The courtroom erupted again, voices shouting, crying, arguing, until the judge slammed his gavel with renewed strength. The sound thundered through the chamber, bringing silence once more. Judge Whitman's voice wavered as he spoke, but his words carried a weight that silenced every heart in the room. This court is no longer about evidence, no longer about accusations. Today, something happened here that cannot be explained by reason, by logic, or by law. He turned his gaze back to Maya, and I cannot ignore it. The little girl smiled faintly, her bear pressed close to her chest. "I told you I'd heal you." For the first time in years, Judge Whitman let out a laugh, soft, almost disbelieving, but filled with joy he thought he had lost forever. And with that, the trial shifted from an inevitable conviction to something far more extraordinary. The miracle wasn't just about a man regaining his strength. It was about truth breaking free, about hope rewriting the rules of justice. But no one knew yet just how far this miracle would go. The courtroom buzzed like a hive disturbed, the miracle still echoing in every mind. People shifted in their seats, whispering frantically, their eyes darting between Maya, James, and the judge who had just stood on his own legs after decades of paralysis. The prosecutor looked as if he had swallowed poison, his face twisted with rage and fear. The defense attorney clutched the edge of his table, as if steadying himself against a wave of something too great to comprehend. But Judge Henry Whitman sat silently in his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the polished wood of his bench. For years, he had presided over cases with cold detachment, priding himself on his strict adherence to the law. Yet now, his very existence had been upended in front of the world. He had been touched by something beyond rules and reason, and he couldn't ignore it. Maya, still clutching her bear, watched him patiently. Her voice had fallen silent, but her eyes spoke volumes. She wasn't pleading anymore. She was waiting, knowing in her childlike heart that the choice was no longer hers to make. The judge's gavel rested heavy in his hand. He lifted it, then lowered it again, uncertain. Finally, he cleared his throat, his voice raw with emotion. "This court has always stood for law and order," he began, his words echoing through the chamber. "But today, something happened here that no law can explain. I stood on my own legs for the first time in 23 years. And I have this child to thank for it." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, jurors leaned forward, and the prosecutor nearly leapt out of his chair. "Your Honor," the prosecutor stammered, "this is irrelevant. The defendant is guilty by every measure of the law. We cannot allow emotions or superstition to dictate justice." Judge Whitman's eyes snapped to him, sharp and unyielding. "Superstition?" His voice thundered. "You call what just happened superstition? You call me standing on my own legs for the first time in decades superstition?" The prosecutor fell silent, his face pale. The judge turned back to the courtroom. "Justice is not blind. Justice is about truth. And the truth I see before me is this: a father accused by circumstance, a little girl who believes in him, and a miracle that has shaken this very foundation. Maya's grandmother, seated in the back, wept quietly, clutching her hands together in prayer. James bowed his head, his shoulders shaking as hope filled him for the first time since his arrest. Judge Whitman looked down at James, his expression softening. "James Carter, I have reviewed the evidence in this case. I have weighed the testimonies, the documents, the arguments. And now, with what I have just experienced, I cannot in good conscience condemn you." The courtroom exploded. Shouts of disbelief, cries of joy, furious objections. It was chaos. Some shouted miracle, while others accused the judge of losing his mind. The jury was stunned, their faces a mix of awe and confusion. The bailiffs struggled to restore order, their own faces betraying the shock they felt. The prosecutor leapt to his feet, his voice desperate. "You can't do this. You're compromising the entire judicial system. This man must be punished according to the law." Judge Whitman rose slightly from his chair again, this time with more confidence. His legs trembled, but they held. The sight alone silenced the prosecutor mid-sentence. "Do not lecture me on the law," Whitman said, his voice like steel. "I have upheld it longer than you've been alive. But today, the law bows to something greater. Today, mercy and truth win." He raised his gavel, his eyes blazing with conviction. "This court finds James Carter not guilty." The gavel slammed down with a crack that echoed like thunder. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then the room erupted again, this time in cheers, sobs, and gasps. James collapsed against the defense table, his head in his hands, overcome with relief. Maya squealed with joy, racing toward her father. The bailiff, tears streaming down his own cheeks, didn't stop her. He opened the shackles with trembling hands, freeing James as his daughter leapt into his arms. Doc James held Maya tight, burying his face in her hair. "You saved me," he whispered. "You saved us both." The prosecutor stormed out of the courtroom, furious, muttering about appeals and corruption, but few paid him any attention. All eyes were on the father and daughter, reunited in a moment of pure, unshakable love. Judge Whitman watched them, his own eyes moist. He pressed a hand to his legs, still marveling at the strength returning to them. For years, he had lived in bitterness, caged by the accident that had stolen his mobility. But in that moment, he realized something extraordinary. He had been healed not just in body, but in spirit. The crowd in the gallery stood to their feet, many crying openly, others whispering prayers of gratitude. Strangers hugged one another, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. Reporters rushed out to spread the story, knowing the world would never believe it until they saw the headlines. "Judge walks after 23 years child's miracle frees innocent father." But amidst the chaos, Maya tugged gently at her father's sleeve and pointed to the judge. "See, Daddy?" she said softly. "I told him I'd heal him. And now you're free too." James kissed her forehead, unable to speak through his tears. Judge Whitman smiled faintly, his stern mask gone. For the first time in decades, he felt truly alive. And for the first time in his career, he knew that justice had been served, not by the letter of the law, but by the power of faith and love. But the story was not over yet, because miracles don't just change the lives of those who receive them. They change everyone who witnesses them. And that courtroom was filled with witnesses. The sound of the gavel still echoed in the courthouse. But it wasn't just the declaration of freedom for James Carter. It was the sound of chains breaking, of lives being rewritten. The courtroom, once a place of tension and despair, now felt alive with something holy, something greater than anyone could explain. People looked around at each other in stunned silence, their faces marked with awe. James cradled Maya in his arms, her small frame pressed tightly against him. He kissed her forehead again and again, whispering words only a father could say in that moment, words of gratitude, pride, and love. His tears wet her braids, but she only smiled, content in the knowledge that she had done what she came to do. Judge Henry Whitman leaned back in his chair, his breathing uneven, his mind spinning. He had just overturned a case that everyone thought was sealed, not because of legal technicalities, but because of a miracle. The courtroom had become a sanctuary, a place where law met faith, and for the first time in decades, the stern, immovable judge felt hope flowing through his veins. His legs tingled with life. He shifted again, testing his strength, and though shaky, they held. His heart swelled. The news spread like wildfire. By the time James and Maya stepped out of the courthouse, reporters were already swarming. Cameras flashed, microphones stretched forward, voices shouted questions. How did the child do it? Judge Whitman, can you confirm you stood and walked? James Carter, how does it feel to be free after facing prison? James shielded Maya from the chaos, holding her close as he answered simply, My daughter believed. And today, belief set us both free. The story ran across every major news outlet within hours. Headlines exploded. Miracle in Atlanta courtroom. Judge walks after 23 years. Child's faith frees father. Heals judge. Is this proof that miracles still happen? Across America, the story sparked debates, discussions, and disbelief. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, while others swore it was divine intervention. But those who were in the room knew the truth. They had seen the impossible with their own eyes. In the weeks that followed, James Carter walked freely through his neighborhood, no longer branded as a criminal, but as the man whose daughter had brought a miracle. Neighbors stopped him on the street to hug him, to tell him they were proud, to thank Maya for her courage. He found work again at the mechanic shop where he once fixed cars, and business doubled because people wanted to shake the hand of a man who had lived through something extraordinary. Maya, still only 8 years old, returned to school, her life almost unchanged on the surface, except now every child whispered her name in awe. Every teacher looked at her with a mix of respect and wonder. But Maya didn't let it change her. She was still the same little girl who loved her bear, who drew pictures in her notebook, and who believed with all her heart that love could heal what the world said was broken. And Judge Henry Whitman, his transformation was the greatest of all. He no longer rolled into the courthouse as a man bound by a wheelchair. Each day, he stood a little taller, his steps growing stronger. Doctors were baffled, unable to explain what had happened. But the judge knew. He had been touched not only in body, but in spirit. The man once known for his coldness now carried warmth in his words. His rulings reflected compassion as much as they did law. He became a symbol of hope, not just for the legal system, but for anyone who had given up on miracles. When reporters asked him how it felt to walk again, he answered simply, "It feels like mercy. It feels like grace." Years later, people still talked about the day the gavel fell differently in Atlanta. The story was told in churches, in schools, in households where people needed to remember that no situation is beyond redemption. But the heart of the story wasn't about a courtroom or even about a miracle. It was about a little girl who loved her father enough to stand against the impossible. It was about a man who nearly lost everything but gained it all back because of the purity of his daughter's faith. And it was about a judge who discovered that sometimes the greatest justice isn't written in law books, but in the simple belief that love is stronger than despair. And now I want to turn this story to you, the one listening right now. What would you have done if you were in that courtroom? Would you have laughed when Maya made her promise? Or would you have believed? Do you think miracles still happen today? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to know how you see this story. And if this story touched your heart, if it made you cry, or if it gave you hope in a time you needed it most, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with a friend, with your family, with someone who needs to be reminded that no matter how dark life gets, light can break through in the most unexpected places. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories of resilience, hope, and miracles. Because in a world that often feels cold, we all need reminders that love, faith, and courage still change lives. After all, if an 8-year-old girl can change the fate of a courtroom and heal a broken man, who's to say what you are capable of?